Everyone, welcome to New Church Nation podcast. My name is Cal Ellerby. I am the church planting catalyst for the Apostolic Church of Pentecost. Our objective is to bring to you practitioners and educators that will help you become effective in establishing faith communities within your own context. Stevenson-Douglas, he is the president of Eston College. I'll let him talk to you about his life a little bit, but most of you know Sean and are knowledgeable about his passion and vision for doing disciple-making stuff. And so we're looking forward to just talking about how do we make a difference, how do we make an impact, how do we address the challenges of our Canadian culture and our nation as a whole. So welcome, Sean. I appreciate you taking the time. I really do. I know that you maybe discovered or at least implemented some DMM foundational things when you were in Turkey. So would you maybe just give me some history on you and where that sort of was given birth and how it got started in your heart?
Thanks, Cal. Yeah, it's awesome to be on. And like you said, I'm sure that lots of your listeners, I would have even had some of these conversations with them, but I appreciate we were volunteering with a number of different organizations and just starting to share our faith organically with our neighbors and things like that. And we actually lived there in a time where the Protestant church, at least, was growing faster than it ever had before. And most of the churches, though, that we went to, if we visited them, international churches, Turkish churches, they didn't function very much differently from a Canadian church. Yeah. Before I moved overseas, especially to the Middle East, I would have pictured a Muslim majority nation being full of the kinds of believers that you read about in some of the best missionary biographies, Voice of the Martyrs, that kind of thing, where you just have all these people and you may not be physically underground, but you're in this gritty setting where people are just praying heaven down and living and dying by the gospel and whatever. And when we got there, we did find some amazing men and women of God, locals and global workers alike. But I will say that I was kind of just surprised that a Sunday morning there was not a whole lot different than a Sunday morning here. And in all the good ways and in all the bad ways, it was just the same. And so although people were coming to Christ, somebody said to me, hey, do you realize somebody did the math? And Turkey's about 0.05% Christian right now. And those are people who'd be confessing Christians. And just like here in Canada, there'd be those who say, yeah, I'm a Christian. Then they come to church a few times a year. They're not very active in their faith, that kind of thing. So I don't know even how many would be active Christians of that 0.05%. And that's mostly clustered in a few big cities. There's a few rural churches as well. But locals often talk about, well, we don't have enough pastors. We need more pastors trained up and whatever else. And so what they're looking for is the same thing that we've got here in the West is what we want somebody who's got a full-time paid salary, and they're going to go out and they're going to take care of a church. And so we're looking at all this and wanting to contribute to it without making it too Canadian and encourage, kind of be Barnabas instead of being Paul for Turkey and find some local Pauls to go out and win the country. But somebody did the math for us and they said, hey, even if the church, which is growing, continues to grow at this rate, it's going to take us over 500 years to get to 2% Christian here in Turkey. And that 2% mark is kind of magical in a sense because that's where a nation can reach itself. It doesn't really need foreign gospel workers anymore. 500 years. And so you think, oh man, that's actually because of how much slower the church is growing than the birth rates. That's nothing. Here at my local church, I'm at Regina Apostolic Church now. Last December, they baptized 18 people. Well, that's incredible. But I'll tell you that in the city of Regina, more than 18 people were born into non-believing homes. So we celebrate every one of those baptisms, and it's not all about numbers, but when we keep things in perspective, like the country was growing much faster than the church was growing when we were in Turkey. And not only that, and I don't remember the numbers of this, but if you rent a church building and you pay a pastor, maybe an administrator, one or two staff to be in all of these cities in all 81 provinces of Turkey, about 85 million people live there. We're talking about literal billions of dollars in order for the church to thrive. And the few churches, 100 churches or so that would be in the country right now, are already struggling to pay the bills. So how are we going to have thousands more churches planted if we
Are you
require all
talking
those
about
things.
Western Canada, or are you talking about Turkey?
I know. Well, and that's exactly my point. The problems are the same because in the kingdom of heaven, just like in other realms, like produces like. So when we grow up in a particular system and then we want that thing to expand, so we grow up in a church system that is attractional and that is built on institutions, then when we say, hey, we want the church to grow, that's a good God-given desire. A lot of times what we really mean is we want the institution to grow, and we're gonna perpetuate those same models. So all that is to say, we were confronted by the fact that to reach the country of Turkey would be impossible if we did it the way that that we just discussed. It just wouldn't keep going, even though there was good fruit from that. There was growing churches and churches being planted according to that model. So we were exposed.
Can I just ask you, was that model developed there with Western influence, or was it just sort of a organic?
No, there would be heavy Western influence.
Okay.
And not only Western, though. I don't know. I wouldn't know a breakdown of the numbers, but there's quite a bit of Korean influence in Turkey. I would say probably half of the workers that are there are Korean. And there's representatives of like Latino global workers and African global workers and Asian global workers. So it's not all just Western, but certainly the established church around the world functions on at least some recognizable similarities.
Right.
Okay, good. And I think later in our conversation we'll probably talk about those. There's really two factors that would get a church kind of and push it in that direction. And anyway, and both those factors were at play in Turkey. So there was a couple of different things that we were exposed to, and you alluded to it already. DMM, disciple making movements, is kind of the approach that we ended up adopting with a group of people. And we were doing everything we could, just trying everything and see how it worked in Turkey for the first couple of years that we were there. And to the day that we left, we continued to work with different organizations who had different approaches as well. But we were doing some ministry along in a Black Sea province where there was no known believers. And we said, okay, we don't live here. So we need something where we can come in, we can witness, we can share, we can encourage a disciple. But how do we disciple somebody if it's not based on a Sunday morning meeting, which we're not going to be able to host all the time? And how do we do this when they have no infrastructure whatsoever? And so when I talk about DMM with people, and when we teach it at the college here as one of the approaches to mission that we encourage people to adopt is, I say it's not so much about the brand. If you get caught up on the brand of DMM or CPM or microchurch, we use those terms fairly interchangeably because it's more about the principles, and those principles are biblical. They're Jesus and Paul's principles than it is about a particular brand. But it just so happened that the brand that we adopted was DMM. And what we did is we would go in and we would meet with people who had responded to ads online and said that they wanted to meet with a believer, or they wanted to read the Bible, they wanted to receive a free Bible, or they wanted to do a course on Christianity. And when we met with them, then we would teach them a very simple discovery Bible study, 7-question approach to inductively read the Bible, which is to say, read it and hear its voice rather than read our questions into it. And we would do Bible studies with people in cafes and in restaurants and parks and in their homes. And we would always ask them, we said, hey, invite your friends to this. So you'd have, one seeker who would say, yeah, sure, I'll invite my friends. We would meet with all kinds of people in all kinds of places. In the last 2 years we were there, we estimate we probably shared with about 2,000 people. And the majority of those 2,000 would be in groups of 3 to 8. And then online as well would be the other big part of that. And that was our approach. And when we came back to Canada, one of the reasons why I began teaching it at the college was that this is a disciple-making approach that can be utilized anywhere by anybody. Any disciple can make a disciple. And what happened during COVID, what I saw, we moved back to Canada right in the middle of COVID. What happened during COVID, Cal, you'll remember, there was like just a panic at the beginning. Yeah. When we lost our Sunday morning meeting, a lot of people, even people who had been in church being quote unquote discipled, for 5, 10, 30, 40, 50 years had no idea what to do when they didn't have that gathering anymore.
Yeah.
How do we disciple our families? What's the next step? How do I take responsibility and ownership for the discipleship of my children or my neighbors? Or I'm in a unique situation where I'm in a workplace that's open here and my pastor, I can't invite somebody to church. That option's off the table, and people didn't know what to do. So we defaulted to just gathering online. And I love DMM and all these other approaches because they equip the everyday disciple with the ability to make disciples, whether or not we can rely on the institution of an established church.
Don, can I ask you a question or make an observation? I think that your emphasis on making a disciple, and you said any disciple can make a disciple. Big difference between what church has often sort of targeted, and that is a convert.
Right.
Big difference between what a disciple is and what a convert is in terms of the interaction with the discipler, with the influencer, whatever you want to call them. Just talk to me about the subtle, I think it's huge, but in some ways it's kind of subtle because, forever missionaries were sent to different countries around the world, basically to make converts.
Right.
How many people got saved? Making a disciple is somewhat different. And
Right.
Just can you talk to me a little bit about your being there and actually embracing this idea of making disciples?
Sure. Well, and as I speak to this, I will just give one asterisk here to say that my answer is going to be informed by DMM, but again, it's not just about one model. So we had a field mentor who didn't like DMM as an approach, but was just a to the bone core, dyed in the blue disciple maker. Mm-hmm. And here's what was the same between, say, a CPM, microchurch, whatever kind of model, and what our field mentor really encouraged us in, and the best of what I got at Eston College and Street Invaders and local churches here in Canada, was that is one subtle shift is that spiritual maturity or the progress, sanctification, isn't measured by increasing knowledge. It's measured by increasing obedience.
Yeah.
Okay. So I said there's going to be two like main concepts. This is one of them. And I think the difference between a convert and a disciple is actually a question of acting on the revelation that we receive from Jesus. That's one of the key differences. Yeah. So if Jesus asks me to relinquish my right to all of the money and the property and the possessions that I have, do I say yes to him? Or do I simply say, well, Jesus calls me to do that, and it becomes merely a cognitive thing where I say in the back of my mind, I know that God owns all. Actually, all my decisions show that really he just wants me to be happy with my stuff. He doesn't have any other plan for it. I say, Jesus calls his disciples. He says, deny yourselves daily, pick up your cross and follow me. Okay. When was the last time I denied myself? How many, I just had 4 pieces of pizza for lunch. I don't even deny myself in a small, worldly, secular way, let alone, Jesus, am I letting you choose how I spend my day? Am I too tired to have this conversation with a person right now? Am I too fearful to reach out in the grocery store and pray for this woman right now? Am I? And so I think that I talked about this at Veteran Camp this year, where we were together, but I think that we have, in our circles, we love grace, and we should. Grace is what it's all about. There's no salvation without grace, and we can't make one forward step without grace. But we misunderstand inaction and grace. We misunderstand inaction and grace. And James says that our faith without works is dead. And I, for years, read that works without faith was dead, but it's backwards. Works without faith are not dead. Faith without works is dead. So a convert, I would say, is somebody who will maybe attend, who will belong when they're asking about a label or a brand. So I would say, sure, I'm an evangelical Pentecostal Christian. I can take that brand on, And somebody would say, well, what does that mean to you? And maybe I could rattle off some basic doctrine and dogma. And that's not unimportant. That's very important. However, the difference between just a convert and a disciple then is that a disciple says, and here's how those thoughts and ideas and revelations and insights into God's character change my life and change the way that I interact with other people.
Which is such a beautiful foundation, because it demands a different mindset, a different paradigm, a different approach to engaging with people when you're looking to do disciple making. You know, I could share 4 spiritual laws, and somebody gives some mental assent to that, or even a genuine, you know, we say, speak with your mouth, believe in your heart, and you'll be saved. That's all, you know, sound biblical truths. We get all of that, but it's been for so long, our objective has been get people to say that. You know, you gotta repeat after me, kind of a thing. But the disciple making movement principles, as you said, demand obedience, and it demands a certain level of a high level of commitment for the person who's doing the disciple making to be engaged and to walk and to get through the, you know, the hard stuff to get to the place of where somebody actually understands what it means to be a follower of Jesus on their own. It's just, I just think that for our churches, and I think for many of our believers, as they think about what is it that God is calling me to, this idea of just trying to get some converts in the door or another notch on my belt because I led somebody through a sinner's prayer. What does it mean to actually get into people's lives and walk with them? Just, I don't want to take away from what you're saying, but I just feel like there's a paradigm shift there that's so critical if we're actually going to embrace meaningful impact when we talk about disciple making.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you. And, you know, outside of my passion about some of these things, and one of my other leanings, is I just love to study church history, and especially ancient church history. And you bring up a couple of things. One is that I think is just relevant to that topic and how it makes us think about disciple making. One is that the sinner's prayer is actually only about 300 years old. Prior to the 1700s, that confession of faith, believing with our heart and confessing with our mouth, that came as a result of understanding, that it could cost you your life. So it's highly costly. And that wasn't always true. You know, there was from about 311 all the way up to the 1700. Yeah, I'm not talking about persecution at all places and at all times in there. But at the very early church, you knew that just going to a gathering of other believers, whether you were a believer or not, could cost you your life. So there had to be something special about that. There was cost involved. But the other side of it then in the 1700s, when the sinner's prayer was created, really, was during the Great Awakening. They said, hey, all these people have all this knowledge. They've been raised up in the church, but it's not affecting their lives in any way. Addictions are running rampant. Crime is running rampant. And people are still coming to church, but they're living like total heathens Monday to Saturday night. And then you just come to church half cut from the night before, you know? Yeah. And so what happened was street evangelists started to go out and say there needed to be a conversion of the heart. And this is where the evangelical movement started, is we said, we it's not enough to just know it. So now confess with your mouth. And so they looked back at Romans chapter 10 and they said, confess with your mouth, believe in your heart. You already have the knowledge, but now will you commit your life to what? Following these things that you have been taught. And so what's happened over the years, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, is that prior knowledge of general Christian principles, biblical realities, has been lost from the unreached that we are trying to reach in our neighbors. They have no context. So if I share the gospel with somebody on the street, let's say they get healed, even like we're doing power events and we go out, somebody had a broken wrist, gets healed, they're having a major encounter with God. And I say, okay, right now, do you want to follow Jesus? And they say, well, is this Jesus? Then sure. And they say yes to that. Great. That's not a bad thing. But there's been no real invitation into the life of a disciple because they don't know what they're saying yes to. Yeah. Beyond a healing.
Yeah. It's such an important reality. You know, I think about people that I've known, people that I've actually done this with, and I've watched it with many people over the years. You meet somebody who's got some struggles in their life, and you say, well, you need to accept Jesus.
Yeah.
So they repeat whatever it is that they're being asked to repeat, and then you kind of like, okay, away you go, go and get better. But the reality is that the Word of God, being spirit, you apply yourself to the application of the Spirit of God through His Word into your life. As you live, as you walk, you begin to see change take place under the authority of the Holy Spirit, because His Word is true and His Word is freedom. But if I just say to you, you just ask Jesus to come into your life and everything's going to change. We have to be honest enough with people and with ourselves to say that unless there's real learning to walk in the Spirit, learning to walk in the Word, learning to apply and obey and live according to the principles of His Word and everything. Yes, we do believe that Jesus brings instant transformation. But if you're dealing with some stuff, and I'll just use one example of somebody close to me who lost both their sons to addictions.
Wow.
And it's like, okay, I don't know where God is. I have no idea what to think. I lost. And you just say, well, accept Jesus, which is the counsel that she was given. And it's like, well, I tried, nothing happened. And I tried to be as, honest as I could when I made the invitation, but nothing's happened. But nobody ever walked with her. Nobody ever engaged in the journey with her. Nobody helped her to pray through the heartache and any of the real disciple-making stuff. And I feel like we're in a time when we talk about, next steps almost with our culture, our Canadian society. The church has got to begin to understand what does it look like to actually not only walk in obedience themselves, but walk with people in their obedience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's like so true. And again, to bring in the historical, and then we'll talk about the Bible as well in a minute, the historical perspective and the biblical perspective on that, is that I think part of the problem, if I was listening to what you just said, and I'm listening to this podcast and I'm in my car and I'm driving, I would say, well, isn't that what happens in church though? Like, and the answer is we are hoping that the ongoing teaching and worship and maybe service, the different services of a local church is gonna make that happen. But I will say that at a certain point, a certain size, an attendance, is that church actually just becomes too big for the moment when you're encountering Scripture together to be a two-way street.
Yeah.
So the kind of transformation that can happen over the Word, if you and I sit down together and you say, hey, Sean, like this is what Jesus is teaching me out of the Bible. And I ask you questions about that. And I give you my perspective on that. Maybe, and we shoe goes on the other foot. I share, like that is deep. And that over time is highly transformative. And it brings relational intimacy and all these kinds of things. And not only that, but it also reshapes our mind. And we are transformed then by the renewing of that mind as well. Mm. Now, let's bring it back, though, to the knowledge obedience thing.
Yeah.
Is that, let's say you and I are doing that. We're having coffee once a week. And we say, hey, let's just go through the book of John together. And so we're reading through the book of John. After a few weeks, if I'm not in any way showing any response to that, you can observe that in my life right away. So, I'm still being unloving to my wife and children. I'm not sharing about the light. I'm living in darkness. I'm doing all these things. Or maybe I'm more of a Pharisee, and we just went through John chapter 4 and the story of Nicodemus, and I'm not getting it. And you're saying, hey man, like you need to live in the Spirit, and I'm just not getting it. You can see that right away. But listen, if we have 100, even just 100 people in church on Sunday morning, and somebody stands up and gives the best sermon you've ever heard, there will be some people who are impacted deeply and maybe who hold on to that. But our current church culture isn't set up so that the next Sunday, everybody stops and says, hey, last week that was great. How did that change your life this week? It's just not a part of it. And that culture of just coming back week after week, we're hearing sermons and we're expecting that there's some kind of process, like watering a seed, that those sermons are just going to bear fruit in our life. That's not untrue, but kind of like my story at the beginning about Turkey, is that it's very slow. And for the person that you brought up who just lost their children, there's no, like, I might be talking about, who knows, like just different prayer methodologies. And she's saying, how do I deal with grief? Or how do I deal with grief? How do I deal with the loss of 2 kids? Where's that in this story? Yeah. And so I think those are 2 totally different things. As soon as you get into it, honestly, I would say a crowd of more than 10 people, then automatically you move more into and here's the Bible college president, right? You move more into a lecture mode than you do a conversational mode. And I think that what distinguished Jesus' teaching is the conversations that took place. The discussions that he would have as he walked with disciples over a long period of time and exposed them to his commands.
We had in our own house church, one of the guys that was a part of it had been in church had pretty much his whole life, or at least for 25 years. And we had a situation where we wanted to pray for some people. We had about 8 or 9 people there. And I said, Mike, we're going to ask this person to sit in the center where we can all get around them and pray for them. Would you lead in prayer? Start, just lay hands on Skell's shoulder and pray for him. So he did. I can tell he's a little bit awkward, and there's lots more to the story. But about a week later, they wanted us to go out and have wings with them. So we go out. And I said, Mike, he's actually the missions director of a large church. So when's the last time you actually laid hands on somebody and prayed for them, specific to their need? And he said, I've been in church for 25 years. I have been the missions director for, I don't know, probably 10 years. He said, I've never once done that. And we had prayed for him afterwards because his business was having some challenges. And I said, well, when's the last time somebody laid hands on you and prayed for you? He said, in 25 years, never happened. And
no.
So my point is this, not to be attacking the church. The model does not facilitate opportunity for that kind of engagement.
Right.
And half of those people in our group were not Christians, and so they're freaked out a little bit by everything anyways, but fascinating to watch the walls of fear and rejection and even curiosity come down when there was such personal interaction that was non-threatening and seemingly, at least at the essence of it, was that there was a genuine sense of concern and love and care.
Yeah.
I cannot overstate the value of that environment and the transformational potential there is for people when they're able to engage it like that.
That is a revealing story. We joke about church ninjas, right? The people who sneak in after the service starts and leave before it ends, and no one ever really knows they're there. When I first started, I was in and out of church.
That.
What's that?
I still do that.
Yeah, you do. When I first started following the Lord, I loved the anonymity because we had been in and out of churches as I grew up, but same kind of thing. I was blessed in a rare minority. I was engaged pretty well as a youth in a lot of different ways. But when I made my faith my own and said, yeah, Jesus, I'm going to follow you, I probably had 6 months in church. And in those 6 months, it's very different than 25 years, but it was not difficult for me to insulate myself so that I could avoid any real interactions. And yet I was still a church goer. So people would say, oh, Sean's going to church. This is great. Like he's doing so much better now. The truth is that I was 1 step into a 1,000 step journey. And in 6 months, I didn't take a second step. I heard lots of sermons and my knowledge grew a little bit, not a little bit, a lot. There were great sermons in that time. And the worship was important. I don't want to minimize any of that stuff. The worship was important for me and all that kind of thing. But I was able to escape any kind of shaping as a disciple in that church by only attending the Sunday morning gathering and not finding any kind of relationship or accountability, transformation, or involvement beyond that.
And the truth is, if we're honest with ourselves, most of us as pastors of traditional churches, and I'm not one now, but in the past, that would have been the primary measuring stick as to whether or not we were happy with what we were seeing in your development. You're there every Sunday. You made yourself available to help, lead worship, do whatever, something, and some element of giving, so that there was indication at least that you were faithful and that you were loyal. We're going to wrap up here in a second, but just talk to me for a minute about you made an interesting observation about being fairly engaged for 6 months before things, whatever. The whole idea going back to the convert versus the disciple. What are your thoughts on the idea of discipling someone to the cross and beyond?
Yeah. When I read the Gospels, I often ask students this when we do Introduction to Mission course here at the college. I say, when did the disciples when were they saved?
Yeah.
And the right answer, even for all of us, like, it's always a trick question. If I was like, oh, Cal, when we were saved, you might say, give me a date and time and talk about that. And that's like true in a sense. That's where you receive salvation. The true answer for all of us is in the moment when Jesus died on the cross, right? Like, our salvation is tied up with that. But if I ask the same question, when did Peter and James and John and Thaddeus walk with Jesus, which was prior to the cross, every time?
Yeah.
So I would say that there is absolutely no reason that discipleship should not start before faith in Christ even. Discipleship is a spectrum, and your moment of confession, your moment of belief, that your salvation, you receive salvation in that moment, and you continue to be saved from that moment onward by grace through faith. But to walk as a disciple, you can start early. And so and I know we're wrapping up. So just to say I baptized with my friend, somebody in Turkey, about 3 weeks before we moved back to Canada. And he was sharing Christ, running meetings, Discovery Bible Study meetings.
Yeah.
He was changing the way that he drank and partied. He was pretty hardcore that way, changing his relationships with women. He was a young guy in university, and a bunch of changes needed to take place. Changing the way that he studied, all in response to walking with Jesus, all before he confessed himself as a Christian for months. Yeah. Yeah. And there was nothing legalistic about that. There's nothing. And so the last thing that I'll say here is that if we define a disciple, and I like to make it one sentence for my students and staff, we say that a disciple is somebody who lovingly obeys the commands of Jesus in relationship with him and makes other disciples to do the same thing. So they do the same thing. Then that doesn't require that you are saved yet. Yeah. But I would say that if you are truly walking with Jesus, he will lead you to the cross. If you've truly encountered Jesus at the cross, you're going to walk with him.
Yeah. It's really, really good. The thing that I'm fishing for in the answers to the question, which you just did brilliantly, is that the fear of standing on the corner and handing out a tract to make a convert versus walking with somebody that you already have some relationship with, whether or not they're a believer yet or not, or a devoted follower of Jesus, are two very different things. And that everybody can be a disciple maker. Not everybody is a street corner evangelist.
Right. Yep.
But everybody can be a disciple maker. And to equip and mobilize every person in the body of Christ as an individual who is intentional about building relationships with people that God has placed in their circle, for the express purpose of seeing them become a fully devoted, passionate follower of Jesus. Everybody can do that.
That's right.
And to mobilize the church in that way is our objective. Hey, man, you just have great wisdom and great insights. I really appreciate your time. And we're going to wrap up. So blessings on you. And thanks for leading us, man.
Oh, it was a real honor and pleasure, Cal. Thank you.